Great Expectations by Charles Dickens, Chapter 10. The felicitous idea occurring to me a morning or two later when I woke up, the best step I could take towards making myself uncommon was to get out of Biddy everything she knew. In pursuance of this luminous conception, I mentioned to Biddy when I went to Mr. Wopsle's great aunt's that night that I had a particular reason for wishing to get on in life, that I should feel very much obliged to her if she would impart all her learning to me. Biddy, who was the most obliging of girls, immediately said she would, and indeed began to carry out her promise within 5 minutes. The educational scheme or course established by Mr. Wopsle's great aunt may be resolved into the following synopsis. The pupils ate apples and put straws down on one another's backs until Mr. Wopsle's great aunt collected her energies and made an indiscriminate totter at them with a birch rod. After receiving the charge with every mark or derision, the pupils formed in line and buzzingly passed a ragged book from hand to hand. The book had an alphabet in it, some figures and tables, and a little spelling. That is to say, it had once. As soon as this volume began to circulate, Mr. Wopsle's great aunt fell into a state of coma, arising either from sleep or from a rheumatic paroxysm. The pupils then entered among themselves upon a competitive examination on the subject of boots, with the view of ascertaining who could tread the hardest upon whose toes. This mental exercise lasted until Biddy made a rush at them and distributed 3 defaced Bibles, shaped as if they had unskilfully cut off the chump end of something more illegibly printed, at the best in any curiosities of literature I have since met, with speckled all over with iron mold, and having various specimens of the insect world smashed between their leaves. This part of the course was usually lightened by several single combats between Biddy and refractory students. When the fights were over, Biddy gave out the number of a page, and then we all would read aloud what we could or what we couldn't in a frightful chorus, Biddy leading with a high, shrill, monotonous voice, and none of us having the least notion of or reverence for what we were reading about. When this horrible din had lasted a certain time, it mechanically awoke Mr. Wopsle's great aunt, who staggered at a boy fortuitously, and pulled his ears. This was understood to terminate the course of the evening, and we emerged into the air with shrieks of intellectual victory. It is fair to remark that there was no prohibition against any pupil's entertaining himself with a slate or even an ink, when there was any, but that it was not easy to pursue the branch of study in the winter season on account of the little general shop in which the classes were holden, and which also Mr. Wopsle's great aunt's sitting-room and bedchamber being faintly illuminated through the agency of one low-spirited dip candle and no snuffers. It appeared to me that it would take time to become uncommon. Under these circumstances, nevertheless, I resolved to try it, and that very evening Biddy entered on our special agreement by imparting some information from her little catalogue of prices, under the head of moist sugar, and lending me to copy at home a large old English D, which she had imitated from the heading of some newspaper, and which I suppose, until she had told me that it was so, to be a design for a buckle. Of course there was a public house in the village, and of course Joe liked sometimes to smoke his pipe there. I had received strict orders from his sister to call him at the Three Jolly Bargemen that evening on my way from school, and bring him home at my peril. To the Three Jolly Bargemen, therefore, I directed my steps. There was a bar at the Jolly Bargemen, and some alarmingly long chalk scores in it on the wall at the side of the door, which seemed to me to be never paid off. They had been there ever since I could remember, and they had grown more than I had. But there was a quantity of chalk among our country, and perhaps the people neglected no opportunity of turning it to account. It being Saturday night, I found the landlord looking rather grimly at these records, but as my business was with Joe and not him, I merely wished him good evening and passed into the common room at the end of the passage, where there was a bright large kitchen fire, and where Joe was smoking his pipe in company of Mr. Wopsle and a stranger. Joe greeted me as usual with, "Hello, Pip, old chap," and the moment he said that, the stranger turned his head and looked at me. He was a secret-looking man whom I had never seen before. His head was all on one side, and one of his eyes was half shut asleep, as if he were taking an aim at something with an invisible gun. He had a pipe in his mouth and took it out, and after slowly blowing all the smoke away and looking hard at me, nodded. And so I nodded, and then he nodded again, and made room on the settle between him that I might sit down there. But as I was used to sit beside Joe whatsoever I entered that place of resort, I said, "No, thank you, sir," and fell into the space Joe made for me on the opposite settle. The strange man, after glancing at Joe and seeing that his attention was otherwise engaged, nodded to me again, and I had taken my seat and then rubbed his leg in a very odd way as it struck me. He was saying, said the strange man, turning to Joe, that you was a blacksmith. Yes, I said it, you know, said Joe. What do you drink, mister? You didn't mention your name by the by. Joe mentioned it now, and the strange man called him by it. You'll drink what, Mr. Gargery, at my expense to top it up with? Well, said Joe, I'll tell you the truth. I ain't much in the habit of drinking at anybody's expense but my own. Habit? No, returned the stranger, but once in a way, and put on a Saturday night too. Come, put a name to it, Mr. Gargery. I wouldn't wish to be stiff company, said Joe. Rum. Rum, repeated the stranger, and will the other gentleman originate a sentiment? Rum, said Mr. Wopsle. 3 rums, cried the stranger, calling to the landlord. Glasses round. This other gentleman, observed Joe by way of introducing Mr. Wopsle, is a gentleman that you would like to hear give it out. Our clerk at church. Ah, said the stranger, quickly cocking his eye at me. The lonely church right out on the marshes and graves round it. That's it, said Joe. The stranger, with a comfortable kind of grin over his pipe, put his legs upon the settle. That he had been himself, he wore a flapping, broad-brimmed traveller's hat, and under it a handkerchief tied over his head in the manner of a cap, so that he showed no hair. As he looked at the fire, I thought I saw a cunning expression, followed by a half-laugh, come into his face. I am not acquainted with this country, gentlemen, but it seems a solitary country towards the river. Most marshes is solitary, said Joe. No doubt, no doubt. Did you find any gypsies now, or tramps, or vagrants of any sort out there? No, said Joe, none but a runaway convict now and then, and we don't find him easy, eh, Mr. Wopsle? Mr. Wopsle, with a majestic remembrance of the old discomfiture, assented, but not warmly. Seems to have been out after such, asked the stranger. Once, returned Joe, not that we wanted to take them, you understand. We went out as lookers on me, and Mr. Wopsle and Pip. Didn't us, Pip? Yes, Joe. The stranger looked at me again, eyes still cocking, as if he were taking aim at me with his invisible gun, and said, He is a likely young parcel of bones, that is what you call him. Pip, said Joe. Christened Pip. No, not christened Pip. Surname Pip. No, said Joe. It's kind of a family name, and he gave it himself when he was an infant and is called by. Son of yours. Well, said Joe, meditatively, not, of course, that it could be in any wise necessary to consider about it, but because it was way at the Jolly Bargeman to seem to consider deeply about everything that was discussed over pipes. Well, no, he ain't. Nevy, said the stranger. Well, said Joe, with the same appearance of a profound cognition. He is not, no, not to deceive you, he is not my nevy. What of the blue blazes is he? Asked the stranger, which appeared to me to be an inquiry of unnecessary strength. Mr. Wopsle, struck in upon that as one who knew all about relationships, having professional occasion to bear in mind that female relations a man might not marry, and expounded the ties between me and Joe, having his hand in. Mr. Wopsle finished off with a most terrific snarling passage from Richard III, and seemed to think he had done quite enough to account for when he added, as the poet says, and here I may remark, when Mr. Wopsle referred to me, he considered it a necessary part of such reference to rumple my hair and poke it in my eyes, and I cannot conceive why anybody of his standing who visited at our house should always have put me through the same inflammatory process under similar circumstances. Yet I do not call to mind that I was ever in my early youth the subject of remark in our social family circle, but some large-handed person took some orthodox steps to patronize me. All this while the strange man looked at nobody but me, and he looked at me as if he were determined to have a shot at me at last, and bring me down. But he said nothing after offering his blue blazes observation until the glasses of rum and water were brought, and then he made his shot, and a most extraordinary shot it was. It was a verbal remark, but a proceeding to dumb show, and he was pointedly addressing to me. He stirred his rum and water pointedly at me, and he tasted his rum and water pointedly at me, and he stirred it and tasted it, not with a spoon, but it was brought to him, but with a file. He did so that nobody but I saw the file, and when he had done it, he wiped the file and put it in a breast pocket. I knew it was Joe's file, and I knew that he was my convict the moment I saw the instrument. I sat gazing at him spellbound, but he now reclined on his settle, taking very little notice of me, and thinking principally about turnips. There was a delicious sense of cleaning up and making a quiet pause before going on in life afresh in our village on Saturday nights, which stimulated Joe to dare to stay out half an hour longer on Saturdays than any other times. The half hour and the rum and the water running out together, Joe got up to go and took me by hand. "Stop half a moment, Mr. Gargery," said the strange man. "I think I've got a bright new shilling somewhere in my pocket, and if I have, the boy shall have it." He took out a handful of small change, folded it in some crumpled paper, and gave it to me. "Yours," he said. "Mind your own." I thanked him, staring at him far beyond the bounds of good manners, and holding tight to Joe. He gave Joe good night, and he gave Mr. Wopsle good night, who went out with us, and he gave me only a look with his aiming eye. No, not a look before he shut it, but wonders may be done with an eye by hiding it. On the way home, if it hadn't been a humour for talking, the talk must have been all on his side, for Mr. Wopsle parted from us at the door, and the Jolly Bargeman, and Joe went all the way home with his mouth wide open, to rinse the rum out with as much air as possible. But I was in a manner stupefied by this turning up of an old misdeed and old acquaintance, and can think of nothing else. My sister was not in a very bad temper when she presented herself in the kitchen, and Joe was encouraged by that usual circumstance to tell her about the bright shilling. "A bad one, I'll be bound," said Mrs. Joe triumphantly, "or he wouldn't have given it to the boy. Let's look at it." I took it out of the paper. It proved to be a good one. "But what's this?" said Mrs. Joe, throwing the shilling and catching up the paper. Two one-pound notes. Nothing less than two fat, sweltering 1-pound notes that seemed to have been on terms of the warmest intimacy with all the cattle markets in the country. Joe caught up his hat again and ran with them to the Jolly Bargeman to restore them to their owner. While he was gone, I sat down at my usual stool and looked vacantly at my sister, feeling pretty sure that the man would not be there. Presently Joe came back, saying that the man was gone, but that Joe had left word at the three Jolly Bargemen concerning the notes. Then my sister sealed them up in a piece of paper and put them under some dried rose leaves in an ornamental teapot on top of a press in a state parlor. There they remained, a nightmare to me, many a night and day. I had sadly broken sleep when I got to bed, thinking through the strange man taking aim at me with his invisible gun, and guiltily coarse and common thing it was to be on secret terms of conspiracy with convicts, a feature in my low career that I had previously forgotten. I was haunted by the file, too, a dread possession to me that when I least expected it, the file would reappear. I coaxed myself to sleep by thinking of Mrs. Habitam's next Wednesday, and in my sleep I saw the file coming at me out the door. Without seeing who held it, I screamed myself awake.